So we'll have Florian Eidenberg present the next panel. Thank you.
It's nice to be here this morning and be witness of this first effort by the Office for Urbanization. Very simple task, introduce the panel, which you already did. I think plugins, so introduce colleagues and friends, which I will do in a little bit. The most difficult task, manage time, is what you asked me also to do. So as we are already delayed, I think I will just jump into introducing the speakers. Plugins, I think the title is pretty self-explanatory, but I'm sure the four panelists will give that more sort of identity and framework. Andrew Witt, Holly Samuelson, Andres Sevcuk, and Silvia Benedito will be presenting. Andrew, you're going to be first, I believe. But I'll introduce everybody bios, and then I guess we'll just go through the presentations. I don't know how they're lined up, but I assume that that will be seamless. Andrew Witt is an assistant professor in practice here at the GSD in architecture, teaching and researching in the relationship between geometry, perception, automation, and culture. Trained both as an architect and mathematician, he has particular interest in technically synthetic and logically rigorous approaches to form. And the funny thing is, Andrew and I have worked together, and he has proven to be incredibly rigorous on a project which I'm sure is not going to be shown here today. Holly, we all know, Holly Samuelson, assistant professor at Harvard Graduate School of Design, teaching architectural technology courses specializing in energy and environmental performance of buildings. Dr. Samuelson research focuses on energy conservation, computerized simulation, occupant behavior, and the future of building practice as it relates to these topics. Andres Sevcuk is assistant professor in urban planning. Previously assistant professor of architecture and planning at the Singapore University of Technology and Design, established in collaboration with MIT. His research interests include urban design and spatial analysis, modeling and visualization, urban and real estate economics, transit and pedestrian-oriented development, spatial adaptability, and urban history. He is the founding director of the award-winning CityForm Lab, which investigates social and economic consequences of urban design and develops new spatial analysis tools for urban planning and development. Silvia Benedito. Silvia is an assistant professor of landscape architecture here at the Graduate School of Design, teaching core and advanced research seminars. Also serves as the co-chair of the sensory media platform at the GSD. Benedito's research and practice are focused on the role of atmosphere. There was a conference here not long ago on atmosphere, and I hope we also speak about the quality of sunlight today, because I was thinking of solar burn and sort of, is sunlight good? We work sometimes on museums and sunlight is really bad. I don't know, it seems that it's already given that sunlight is good today, but yeah. yeah. So hopefully we can also talk about qualities of light, not just light per se. But Sylvie, is also the co-principal of Officina. Is it Officina or Officina? Yeah, an architecture and landscape urban design practice based here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and also in Ingolstadt, Germany. So Andrew Witt, please kick it off.
All right. So today I'm actually going to share a few observations, not so much on heliomorphism, but rather on the process of constructing a research paradigm, with some possible reflections on research as a project at the school. And so here I'm less concerned actually with the energetic and ecological approach to heliomorphism, but instead hope to excavate it as an archetypal design science in order to perhaps understand what relevance that term and its heuristics have for our own intellectual context. So, okay. My introduction to heliomorphism was actually quite pragmatic, probably like many designers, and entirely ignorant of its history. It came through consulting on the kinetic facade for this project, the Al Bahar Towers in Abu Dhabi, which was a somewhat quixotic project which attempts to clothe an all-glass building in the middle of the tropics with a literal sunscreen. The project was a veil of sun-actuated mechanical shades with an intricate control and folding mechanism, the details of which are, of course, sort of fascinating in their own right, but like many problems of practice, and particularly of design science, it appeared without a history or culture of the problem itself. Now, at the time, I was sort of actively researching the early history of design computation in the 60s and 70s and was curious to some extent if there was some early digital approach to these perennial and recurring problems. So as a result, I researched, or as a result of that research, I happened upon the proto-computational work of Ralph Knowles. And so, of course, in my early discussions with Charles, it was, I don't know, there was this moment of resonance where I was like, oh, you know about Knowles? And then there's like domino effect and sort of people come out of the woodwork that have him as sort of a mentor, otherwise sort of precedent. So Knowles was arguably the pioneer in projective solar access envelope design, a method that reciprocally shaped both the building and the city around it. And since I sort of have this ongoing hobby of collecting oral histories of design scientists, I tracked down his phone number, gave him a cold call while I was in LA, and interviewed him a couple of years ago in his Silver Lake home. So it was this really funny moment where something that I had sort of like filed away in the archives suddenly became sort of at least partially relevant. And it's also a little bit ironic that Steve Beer was mentioned, because he was someone else who I sort of informally interviewed, and Steve was like, oh, I've been contacted by many researchers from Harvard over the years, but you're the first one that I actually want to talk to. So I was like a little bit gratified by that. Anyway, I have something of an interview bedside manner, hopefully. Okay, so what I found in this interview, and there'll be details of the interview to sort of come out, but what I found in this interview was not only a timely design agenda, but also a pattern for the development of an objective design methodology, which was, of course, rigorously worked out over the course of about 4 decades. Instrumentation was key to that agenda, and as part of that instrumentation project, he constructed specialized machines called heliodons, one of which we see here sort of in the background context, which allows the free but measured orientation of the light source of a building. And the construction of sort of novel heliodon typologies and geometries was kind of something of a cottage industry in the late 60s. So you can see another one which was sort of another patent which was filed sort of during the same period. And if you dig, there's quite a few of these. It wasn't just Knowles, but it was interesting that this process of natural simulation actually had a mechanical implementation. In fact, he developed a whole range of mechanical environments, including wind tunnels, water tables, and other sort of testing apparatus to consider erosional processes. So the studio was thus transformed in a very tangible way to a laboratory that was dense with instrumentation. What further intrigued me about Knowles was actually his very broad range of influences, broad and both broad and idiosyncratic, that he and his interlocutors, particularly people like Konrad Wachsmann and Peter Pierce, drew on in the delineation of a specific brand of design research. And here I wanted to emphasize 3 that I thought were particularly germane to the contemporary discussion on heliomorphism: war games, crystals, and collectives. So a bit of further background on Knowles. He grew up in a rural community in Ohio, and he, in our interview, sort of described himself as a nature lover. In particular, when someone describes themselves as a nature lover, I always feel like slightly skeptical. But anyway, I think he bore it out with the rest of his sort of trajectory. He told me for him it was never enough to operate on the basis of feeling, and that his mathematical background, although it wasn't necessarily much beyond the sort of like typical high school education, was profoundly influential. And he studied electronics in the Navy, and then was a student at the School of Design in Raleigh, North Carolina, where he worked on Buckminster Fuller's cardboard section domes. And if you've seen these domes, it's actually there's actually a very striking similarity with the morphology of many of Knowles' later projects. Essentially, there are these sort of triangular sections that create this sort of there's actually an intimation of self-shading when these things are fully constructed. So it's a very tangible precedent in a way. So he was deeply influenced by Fuller actually on many levels, as we'll see, but not uncritically. So shortly after his work at MIT, he took a position at USC and began his career's work around solar access. And around 1963, he began this long speculative investigation of sort of two reciprocally related projects. The first are these lattice-like architectures generated partially through envelope studies, and again, sort of like bearing the mark of Fuller's cardboard domes. What was interesting is that in our interview, Knowles sort of acknowledged that these are not so much buildings as graphs of force effects. Yet they affirmed that fitness was amenable to testing, and they constructed parametric proxies for design spaces. The second project was Knowles' projective proposal for a massive urban aggregation in the heart of Owens Valley, California, essentially a huge desert region, this sort of modern Anasazi construction, which was architecture on a geographic scale, taking the solar envelope to its limit. So to develop these proposals, Knowles' instrumentation extended to early forays in digital simulation. So to my knowledge, he was among the first to develop software specifically designed for the generative construction of sort of solar or heliomorphic architecture. And that occurred as early as 1968 when he used some parameterizations of surface and volume ratios in his study of the Owens Valley. What was interesting in sort of in the conversation with him, and also obviously from his work and writings, were the very strong parallels between his sort of approach to heliomorphism and this construction of the war game. In its consideration of bounded, modular, and discretized area of permutable action, Knowles' work resembles nothing so much as this type of endeavor. And this is actually a quote from the 1983 movie War Games, which I actually think is particularly appropriate. The zero-sum idea actually is in a way a game that's impossible to win. And so is there some exercise in futility in doing this? Maybe. So the first instance of the modern war game was developed in Germany around 1824 as the so-called Kriegsspiel. The military strategist Leopold Reiswitz and his son Georg developed a modular landscape to simulate tactical encounters in a free but rule-based way. And this was interesting to me because the detail of this landscape was actually very specific and particular. And there was a process of discretizing the territory and making each of those modules sort of performative, which was sort of fundamental to the idea of the war game. These war games could be seen as a type of proto-cybernetic tool, actually intensifying feedback around strategic contingencies for specific instruction. And this was something that emerged specifically in Germany, but by the sort of dramatic success of the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, they became a standard element of strategic and military planning globally, and ultimately a sort of popular, if arcane and complex parlor game. And in particular, I find this sort of image of H.G. Wells' sort of like absorption in this war game, which also has architectural elements, very telling of its broad influence. So the influence of the war games on questions of resource distribution in mid-century was broad and profound. Of course, those had been sort of adapted and somewhat digitized as early as World War II, but virtually every discipline in strategic scenario planning had roots in war games. In fact, by the 60s, the premise of the war game was adapted by Buckminster Fuller for his loosely renamed World Game, an attempt to engineer play conditions which would reveal specific solutions to problems of systemic global interdependence. So like Knowles, Fuller had spent time in the Navy and no doubt encountered war games there, but his approach to the systemic inventory of global assets and resources was novel. And so, in the instructions for the war game, in the instructions for the world game, there's this very dense inventory of, very detailed inventory actually, of all of the possible assets that could be called on for human survival. And so there's a choreography of those assets that becomes central to the process of the war game. It was an attempt to, so like Knowles, Fuller had spent time in the Navy and no doubt was introduced to war games there. His approach to inventory of global assets was novel. So the experience was decidedly modern and actually quite media intensive. So these are projected maps, projective overlays with electrical networks, air transport, mineral and food resources, and population centers that provide a totally immersive experience for that game. So analogously, the geographic dimension of Knowles' Owens Valley project was diagrammed, and to the extent that the environmental forces became a kind of natural battle plan. It's a territorial framework of space and time designed to play out conflicts not between state actors, but instead between humanity and nature. So instead of having this adversarial relationship with other populations sort of coordinate in contest in a way with nature. So these resource war games even became a sort of subgenre of those broader parlor games, which were very much in evidence in the 70s. And so this is one of several kinds of games which played out these territorial disputes as political conflicts. So next, let's talk a little bit about crystals. Always a fun topic. The framework, the Owens Valley structures, which we see here, were clearly fundamentally lattice-like. And so in that sense, of course, Knowles sort of drew on certain precedents from Fuller. Every dwelling was shaped by all the others interdependently, and in this sense, echoed also closely the work of Peter Pearce and Conrad Boxman, who we'll discuss in just a minute. So as an earnest investigation of the logic of natural forms, of course, this wasn't unique to USC at the moment. There was sort of a broad preoccupation, but these three investigators sort of formed something of a nucleus of a crystallographic approach, and in some ways sort of took that process of sort of framing territorial and resource issues in terms of lattices much further than I'd seen elsewhere. So as an example of that, I think Knowles, or I think Peter Pearce's research is really sort of core. These are combinatorial studies that Pearce did around sort of the spatial discretization of volumes and the relative sort of granularity, performance, and sort of operational effect of each of these different types of discretization methods. So the level of research, and of course he has a couple of full volumes essentially on these kinds of studies. The assumption was that this sort of like unitized space would also become this fundamental basis of environmental analysis, and that was something that was shared by all three of these researchers. So of course, these sort of crystal forms created remarkable landscapes in the envelope of Knowles projects. And it sort of extended the discretization of the territory into the dwelling itself. So there was this idea of deep continuity, not only in operation, but also in form. So the difficulties and intricacies of constructing such oblique forms led to a whole range of, again, sort of novel mechanical inventions. Boxman's universal positioner, or as Knowles called it, the universal motion machine, was built as a way to automate the orientation and construction of these crystalline forms. So what I find kind of fascinating about this device is that it's a device, essentially at the scale of the robot that we have in the basement, using all of the same motions and being orientable in all of the same ways, and except manually, basically. And this allows for the construction of these highly sort of essentially mass customized assemblies. And at the same time, it mirrors in a very fundamental way the heliodon that Knowles himself had developed. So this idea of instrumentation became something that was transferable from performance also to assembly, and we see this sort of reciprocity between machines of knowledge and machines of making and construction. So finally, I want to touch on the notion of collectives. So prescient as it was in many ways, Knowles' research was only one of a species of contemporary projects which considered systemic risk and attempted to formulate scenario rules as opposed to specific design proposals. And so I think this sort of like touches also on this idea of the singularity. And at this moment, there was a realization that the singularity wasn't sufficient to deal with these systemic risks. So both the aims and products of architecture became, in a way, collectivized. So Knowles' interdependent vision of design followed organically from his view that natural processes could include not only those of the physical environment, but also those emerging from the rules of social organization. So when, there are several passages in Knowles which are sort of as close as you can get to structuralist sociology in the context of architecture. And he was fascinated by how the social structures, for example, of the Anasazi had this very specific conversational relationship, essentially with form generation. There was a very close interactivity there. So in such a frame, architecture becomes something which is an act of collective consequence, promulgating regimes not only of collective social benefit, but risk. So I think this is one of the key things actually to come out from this period, sort of predating the oil crisis, is that there was a recognition that architecture is often sort of proposed in terms of collective benefit. And this idea of also sort of calibrating or quantifying risk associated with joint endeavors became super fundamental. So that collectivity extended to design culture itself, and in particular the sort of epistemological project of design. So in this sense, there was a profound resonance of Knowles' specific approach and the broader design science decade, which Buckminster Fuller declared in 1963. So, this project hoped to unify design culture through collective knowledge, through shared methods and shared challenges. And so ironically, this decade, sort of the beginning of this decade coincides exactly at the moment when Knowles was beginning at USC and beginning to sort of instrumentalize his studio into a laboratory, and also coincides almost exactly with Conrad Waxman's time at USC. So it's a very, happens to have been a very appropriate bracketing of that time. And perhaps again, ironically, it was at the end of that decade that the limits or even futility of those collective ambitions were laid bare by the oil shortages of '73, which have been mentioned. So today, I think it's fair to ask whether collectivism is even possible in the same way. And there's quite a lot of optimism actually around and even sort of boundless faith in collective self-organization. I almost see if this photo were updated, this would be sort of a swarm of self-driving cars, for example, each of those operating in a very sort of self-directed way and uncoordinated on some level. It's really kind of hyper-capitalism, but is this kind of where we're at design? Is there nothing that we can offer sort of beyond that? So Knowles created an organizational blueprint for modern design research, which we in some ways are unconsciously returning to. So this idea of the laboratory, this idea of instrumentation, this idea of working on sort of combinatorial problems as opposed to the development of these specific singular moments. But it's in the social lessons of the Knowles project with which we're left the most ambiguous legacy. So engineered systems are only as effective as they are resilient. And in the age of accelerating environmental, political, and economic shocks, perhaps the lesson of design science is as much a cautionary one as anything else. So, thanks.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to present two pieces of two projects that I thought would relate to this crowd. And the thing that they have is that they're designing for future contexts. Okay, so the first project is actually a student project that was in my daylighting class. It's about a 2 to 3 week project, and the students had the option of redesigning a prototype early childhood family and development center in Rwanda. This was a project that was sponsored by a number of NGOs. And so far, 8 centers had been built around Rwanda, and they were reevaluating the project and planning to build a number more. And one of the lessons learned from the first round was that there was poor daylighting in the centers. Rwanda is equatorial, so with a strong overhead east-west sun path. And here's an image of the first round of the centers. Now, in these rural locations, there is either no electricity or it's prohibitively expensive. So these centers had to operate, they're mainly preschools, with daylight alone. Also, there's no heating or cooling systems, so having a well-tuned solar design was imperative. They were also built by hand, mostly with unskilled local labor. There's pictures of women bringing water by hand to the sites to mix concrete, mostly women sitting and breaking apart rocks to make the aggregate for the gravel and the concrete. So that's the premise of this project. This is a construction photo, so there would be a roof. So there were 2 prototype designs, and they would be built throughout the country. If you're familiar, Rwanda has a very hilly terrain. So each of the plans needed to be rotated at each site to accommodate the terrain. So that makes an interesting challenge when you need to have a well-tuned solar design, and at the same time, you don't know what direction the plan will be located. And you also are dealing with an unskilled labor force for the most part. So one student pair, Huishan He and Rufei Wang, produced this project where they decided to focus on manipulating voids in the brick pattern to try to allow as much direct light in as possible as much indirect light in as possible while blocking the direct light in terms of heat gain. So they took 2 approaches. The first was a parametric design approach, and we talk about that a lot, but in case you're not familiar, the idea of parametric design is that you're making the rules or the parameters for the design. For example, you might be manipulating the length of an element based on some other variable. So they were doing this in Honeybee. But honestly, this project, they also did a hand approach with old-fashioned sun path diagrams, which worked pretty well. So if you remember these from school, then you know that the blue is the hours of the year, the hours of the day, and these are the months of the year. Here's the azimuth angle of the sun, and here's the altitude, basically looking at a plan of the sun, the sky dome. So they took, you can't see it here, but they've outlined the operable hours, and then they're looking at each brick pattern in terms of its altitude and azimuth that it would permit into the space. And then basically they just figured out, okay, which of the 360-degree compass orientations would this brick pattern be applicable for? And they basically did that with all of their brick patterns and created a pattern book, if you will, to pick out for each 360-degree compass orientation which of the brick patterns you could choose from. And so then they tested their results. So here's a plan, and they're indicating which brick pattern they're using. And then they used another simulation software, Diva for Rhino, to test various daylight metrics, and they were able to show that their design would perform better than the existing design. So that was the first project I wanted to show. The second one is a research project that I was involved in. We called it energy vernacular for short because we said, okay, vernacular architecture took generations and generations of learning to create the optimal design for a site. But we're saying now, well, with computerized simulation, you can run through thousands of simulations very fast. So can you use that to create a new vernacular? But here we're looking at parametric energy simulation in high-rise residential buildings. And our research motivation was partially this urbanization. As you know, 55% of the world's population lives in urban areas, and it's expected to increase to 66% by 2050. And with all of that growth, we cannot afford to simply replicate standard building practices, as you know. And also with all of that burden on existing energy infrastructure, we need to think about what we're doing. And with new construction, we have a great opportunity. So for anyone that's been involved in low energy design, you know that as architects, we pretty much have 2 main resources to choose from for guidance. The first is basically generic energy codes. So here's an example of the climate zones for the ASHRAE 90.1 model US energy code. So it might consider a hotel in downtown Baltimore very similarly to an office building in rural San Francisco or suburban San Francisco. So we have that level of specificity. Or at the other end, we have ultra-specific customized computer simulations that are done for each project. Oftentimes, if a project can afford to do this, too late in the project to really inform the early phase design decisions anyway. So I'm asking, with today's computational power, is there anything in between? Of course, there are resources in between, but this is the vast majority of what people are using right now. So we wanted to take a look at that, and we chose 3 sites to start our investigation. We're looking at high-rise residential buildings. And we chose 2 fast-growing megacities, and 1 also fast-growing megacity with tall buildings for which we had a lot of urban data. What we did was we set up a number of design parameters that we wanted to perturb. They ranged from building shape to orientation, window size, window-to-wall ratio, and we chose inputs that we felt were realistic, so basically either code standards for today or realistic choices that firms might be looking at in the next few years. So this led to about 12,000 design permutations, and I'm going to get into, we looked at various contexts, so altogether about 90,000 simulations, which we ran on the cloud. And I'll just run a little video of running through our Grasshopper script. We used ArcSim to combine the parametric design with Energy Plus simulation engine. And we decided to use an exhaustive search brute force method running through all the simulations. You could also use an optimization algorithm, but we decided that we wanted to be able to analyze this whole body of results. I think that's important to be able to understand, well, how bad is the second place design and how much of a compromise is that? So we also, in this project, we're testing other design objectives. So normally people are looking at the energy use intensity, but we decided, well, in fast-growing megacities, one of the biggest problems is the peak load, actually, because the utility infrastructure can't handle the new growth. So that should be something that we could be looking at. And we also had a passion for passive survivability. So we know that at-risk populations have an increased risk of morbidity and mortality in a power outage, so due to the indoor temperatures. So we wanted to see which designs, this is basically simulating New York City in a power outage in winter, so which of the designs would give the safest indoor temperatures. But what I'm going to focus on talking about here is the energy results, the heating, cooling, lighting, load results. Part of what we did was to promote a framework for the use of parametric simulation in early phase design, including using a sensitivity analysis, so finding out, okay, which of the design decisions were the most important of the parameters that we tested. I thought it might be interesting to this crowd to mention that the window size was by far the most important design parameter to choose from of the ones that we tested. And between 30 and 90% window-to-wall ratio, the smaller windows always were better in terms of energy. Unfortunately, I love a lot of glass. But it's always important to ask what were the assumptions behind that, so I'll tell you that the natural ventilation did not vary depending on the window size. But moving on, okay, so I wanted to talk about this sliver of the project within this conference. We were looking at, well, what about the urban context? So let's imagine that you're designing a high-rise in one of these 3 real locations. Well, if you go to the energy code, this is how it's considering your building. So it's giving you advice on the window sizes, the shading, the glass properties, assuming that your building is pretty much in an open field. So we wanted to ask the question, well, does urban context matter? And in this case, we're thinking about other buildings as merely shading elements. Future work could consider other buildings as reflecting light or the urban heat island effect, et cetera. But here's one example from our research. We showed that in the New York context, considering context made a difference. So there was a significant increase in the cooling, in the heating, and a significant decrease in the cooling load, depending on whether or not you included the context. So yes, it does matter. But I think that there's a more important question to ask here, and I don't hear this asked often enough, or ever. Does urban context change the optimal design decisions? So, okay, it changes the energy use. Well, as an architect, how does that affect me? So I want to ask, are we misleading ourselves if we're using these resources as design decision tools? So here's one example in our research from the Shenzhen context. By the way, I'm just showing one floor of the high-rise building. But you can see that if you considered it without context or with context, the winning design changed significantly. There was a different shape, a different solar orientation, and a different shading design. So the answer here is yes, we are misleading ourselves if we are not considering the urban context. So urban context is important to consider in low energy design. But what if the details of the urban context are unknown? And I think this is probably why we've been ignoring it. If you're a policy maker, then you're writing policy for a number of buildings, in a number of contexts. Or this could even be the case if you're an architect and you're in a fast-growing city where the context could be changing around you. So we were proposing, well, make the best guess with the best available information that you have. And it's probably more than nothing. So let's consider that example again where you have 3 real contexts. So these are models of 3 neighborhoods in New York City, and we're considering this our ground truth. We're trying to match this value. And we said, well, let's create an algorithm to generate a random context. So here we have, we basically used the fixed street grid, we input FAR and the maximum building height. And then we use a randomized process to develop contexts. And we wanted to compare that to considering no context at all and look at the percentage errors in each case. We also promoted the idea of why not repeat this multiple times? And that way, if you're making policy, you can look at the extremes of the possible effects. And also you could average all the results to kind of normalize for any anomalies. So in this case, we did it 50 times. So here's one example of the results that we received in the New York neighborhood. You can see that the estimated context, this is just a box and whisker plot, so taking all of 3,000 design cases, what were the estimated cooling loads. And you can see that, not surprisingly, the estimated context got much closer to the real context than the no context. Okay, surprise, surprise. But I think the thing that was interesting was just the magnitude. So the error reduction was significant. So I ask you, should energy guidelines for architecture consider urban context? And then more broadly, can we do better than a one-size-fits-all energy code or an ultra-specific simulation, one-off for each building that then remains in one firm's database? And is there anything in between? Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I will be talking a little bit about the real-life examples of heliomorphic towns and some personal experiences with it, and try to generalize some of the lessons of how they have impacted the history of urban planning and urban design. So you could say, I suppose, that I actually grew up in a heliomorphic project. This was a project called the Anne microregion in Tartu, Estonia, which was designed in early 1980s by Mart Port and was partially built by 1983. It was a rather typical example of Soviet town planning because Estonia at the time was occupied by the Soviet Union until 1991, where much attention was paid to solar access to all residents equally. Buildings did not follow streets. In fact, it is hard to see whether there were any streets at all. Facilities for satisfying all sorts of daily needs, such as kindergartens, schools, shops, playgrounds, were planned nearby according to careful norms. Here you can see in the red outline the building where my flat was, located in. In the summer, the sun rose in my bedroom around 4 a.m. and it set late in the evening into another bedroom on the opposite side of the flat around 11 p.m. And in the winter, the sun rose around 10 a.m. and set around 4 p.m. at a slightly different angle. So you can say that there really was never a lack of sunlight caused by architecture or planning in my residence. The only lack was caused by the fact that I was living far north on the 58th latitude, same as Anchorage, Alaska. After all, I was living in a public housing complex that was deeply inspired by modernist principles of town planning. Slabs in a park, as envisioned, for example, in Le Corbusier's La Ville Radieuse from 1930, and later theorized as part of Jacques d'Athènes 3 years after. The concept of free site planning was further developed by Walter Gropius, who ended up right here at the GSD. And in his site plans and housing districts in Germany, Gropius advocated an arrangement of buildings that were oriented more towards the sun and daylight than the people, businesses, or movement that was found on traditional streets. These modernist heliomorphic ideas of site planning and housing design have had a tremendous influence globally on housing projects. Curiously, though, their influence has almost entirely been reserved for public housing, where the inhabitants generally have little say in the design of their own inhabitation environments. This is another example from a heliomorphic microregion project in Estonia called Õismäe that was arranged around a circular lake, and differently from other microregions, this is a holistic kind of town design that contained everything necessary for daily life in one project. But you can see that the same principles can be found at work in other countries around the world. It's very easy to distinguish public housing projects oriented towards the sun in London's council estates. Here in the United States, most notably the Pruitt-Igoe public housing project in St. Louis, which was built in 1956 and actually blown up in 1972. And one of the unfortunate facts of the project was it was actually designed by Minoru Yamasaki, the same architect who designed the World Trade Centers. Similar principles of site planning can also be found in massing in public housing projects right here in Cambridge. This is the Newtown Court on Main Street next to MIT. And these orientations of buildings, which distinctly differ from the rest of the environment around them, tend to immediately signal to passers-by that this is public housing where the poor live. But public housing in the context of Singapore, for instance, has no stigma attached to it whatsoever. There are about 85% of the population who live in public housing in Singapore, and Singapore's Housing Development Board is perhaps the most innovative and impressive housing authority in the whole world, currently innovating at all levels with public housing designs. The image here shows a view of the newly released design for Tengah New Town, which was actually just released last week and will be built in the next decade or so. But despite the abundant access to sunlight, these so-called free plans and heliomorphic projects where buildings are oriented towards the sun rather than the life on the street also produce a series of known problems. Not only the stigma issue, which I already alluded to, but also other development problems. I would just like to highlight three particular issues which may be directly linked to the solar orientation of buildings in their plans. There are many more issues with public housing towns that can be discussed in other contexts, but this is just to focus on the orientation of site plans. First, many housing environments produce large open spaces, usually called green spaces in the design phase, but once built, they tend to become pretty run down, lack clear responsibility and care. They get overtaken by parking, grow in weeds, and nobody has direct ownership of them in most cases. Pedestrians, if you see any moving outside, tend to be distributed all over the large area without any clear concentrations of sidewalks or streets where a large number of people could be seen together. Second, orienting buildings away from the street tends to make it pretty hard to understand what streets really are and where people's movement flows could concentrate. This has direct consequences on the commercial land uses of an area, such as retail and service establishments that depend very much on passing footfall. Walking into a store here may require around a 50-yard detour off the street, which doesn't have many pedestrians to begin with. And as a result, we usually find very little commerce and other than housing land uses in such projects, and commerce tends to not remain viable. And third, the lack of streets also makes it quite complicated for the residents to read the environment and also visitors. This lack of legibility leads to a poor identity of a place that people don't strongly associate with. And this issue has been talked about at length in Kevin Lynch's work on imageability and legibility of cities. Now, Another approach to achieving solar performance is shaping the building forms instead of site plans. This is what Knowles' work that has been outlined on multiple occasions here today is focused on. Whereas heliomorphic site planning tends to produce more problems than benefits, as I've tried to outline, I think that this procedure of shaping building forms and heights so as to maximize or minimize sun access, depending on which part of the world we're in, has a lot more prospect and positives to it. And the approach can also work with different district plans and layouts without intervening too much with the first couple of ground floors of buildings, which are by far the most important parts of the built environment in shaping our impressions as seen from the street. Now, there are a number of recent solar envelope software applications and approaches that have been developed and picked up since Knowles' original work. Here you can see an urban form analysis actually performed from LiDAR scans, which are kind of little airplanes that fly over districts with lasers. And based on a LiDAR scan of a district, Eugenio Morello, who's the author of this work, has developed an algorithm for dynamically creating solar envelopes for any vacant sites for new projects. More recently, a lot has been heard about with a new software called City Engine that is now being marketed by ESRI and was developed originally at ETH. And City Engine makes procedural urban modeling accessible to a lot more people. And one of the promises of procedural urban modeling is that it also could enter a kind of constraint-based modeling phase where we get to establish certain performance criteria and only generate solutions that respond to these performance criteria. And on that regard, we should pay attention to Carlos Vanegas' work, who has developed an alternative to City Engine called Urban Sim, or now marketed as Urban Canvas. It's another procedural modeling engine, and here's a paper by Carlos where he actually demonstrates reverse or inverse procedural modeling, where constraints are included in the parameters of the model to begin with. So any urban solution that is generated will already produce certain solar outcomes and also access to park or other kind of performance variables that are being tested. So it iterates behind the scenes through millions of solutions to come up with only those that actually correspond to desirable criteria. Here's another example where from the left to right, procedurally the distance to park is modeled, and the big difference from normal computer-generated architectural shape grammars and procedural models is that these grammars are not coded in by the user. This is a constraint that's already in the model, so whatever grammar the user applies will be guaranteed to produce a certain outcome that's desired. Now, when we talk about urban form, I think it's also important to stop and look at some of the lessons from some of these modernist built examples. And I think one of these lessons from the above modernist solar-inspired projects is that an excessive emphasis on any one quality of urban form is usually quite dangerous and should instead be balanced with a simultaneous emphasis on multiple performance dimensions. And Kevin Lynch down the street at MIT spent a whole career thinking about what are the fundamental dimensions of a good urban form. And one of those was vitality. And I think that, let me see if we can, I think that heliomorphism kind of falls under this broad category of vitality, which basically describes the degree to which the form of the settlement or the built environment supports the biological well-being of its users. And there's other dimensions beyond the heliomorphic that go under that, but it's an important criterion. But the others include sense, which is the degree to which the inhabitants can legibly understand an environment and memorize it and identify with it, a particular aspect he spent a lot of time working on himself. Fit, which is the capacity of the built environment to contain or accommodate particular uses, basically how well form corresponds to function. Access, the ability to reach desirable people or places in the environment. control, which describes the degree to which the participants or users of an environment can actually adapt it or control it for their own benefit. I think these are all very important things to keep in mind at the same time. And as one French urbanist that I worked with, Yves Lyon, once told me, no urban element should ever be designed to only do one thing, but it rather should always do at least 3 things at the same time. My own work has not really focused on the degree of vitality or design around the sun or any other environmental parameter, but more has been focused on the questions of access and control, which I find very interesting and important as well for town planning. And this has been done in the context of the City Forum Lab, which is a new research lab we have here at the GSD, and focuses on issues of urban form from social, economic, and environmental perspective. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of very short examples, but starting with a video that describes a piece of software we have designed that looks at access, that parameter that I just mentioned. So if we can start the video, please.
The evolution of cities is built upon the interaction of people. People meet friends or strangers on streets, buy goods from markets, or collaborate to form enterprises. The urban-built environment is the arena where these interactions take place. One of the primary challenges of good city design is therefore to maximize interactions between people and places while minimizing friction. Contemporary cities generate volumes of data that offer unprecedented opportunities to address this challenge. These data can help us understand how the human interactions that cities facilitate can deliver social, economic, and environmental rewards. Many urban activities can be shown in numbers by counting purchases in stores, tallying traffic on streets, tracking real estate transactions, or following business location patterns. In addition to social activities, cities also have physical infrastructure, which can also be abstractly represented. A complex built environment can be reduced to 3 basic elements: links, representing paths along which travel can occur; nodes, representing the intersections where 2 or more paths cross and public spaces form; and buildings, where most human activities take place and where the movement of people, goods, and information begins or ends. This framework allows us to describe spatial relationships between people, places, and institutions using powerful network analysis methods. How can we use this method to describe a city? The reach metric, for instance, characterizes the number of particular destinations that can be reached from any location in a city within a given access radius. If the destinations describe the number of residents, then the metric tells us how many residents one can access around each building. We can specify a similar measure for the number of jobs in each building, or floor areas, and perform the analysis with a different network radius, depending on what mode of travel we assume the trips to take. If we add up all these travel costs to individual destinations, then we can also determine the closeness of each location, which forms another metric. Or consider the betweenness index, which estimates how in between other locations a building is. If we know that in the morning peak hour commuting occurs from subway stations to office buildings, then the betweenness index can estimate the trajectories that such trips are likely to take and tell us which buildings are passed most often along the way. The different specifications of network analysis yield a series of results describing proximities and adjacencies between people and places, which can be important for locating a business, explaining traffic patterns, or the value of land in different parts of a city. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, for instance, there are roughly 15,000 buildings, and to calculate any of these metrics requires exponentially as many more calculations. It would be impossible to calculate these indices manually. That's why we are introducing the Urban Network Analysis Toolbox that is designed to automate these calculations on a computer. The toolbox is built on top of the GIS platform, which allows us to easily combine urban network analysis with other types of data and spatial analysis approaches. Urban network analysis can describe complex spatial problems and help us address fundamental questions of good city design. Can the layout of a city facilitate equitable access to the city's resources? How does the form of a neighborhood affect the economic performance of its enterprises, or our perception of its quality, its livability? Urban network analysis offers a useful framework that allows different professionals to describe dense urban environments with clarity and precision, and thereby address a critical step in developing a better understanding of how we shape our cities, and how they, in turn, shape us.
Okay, so just using slides, I wanted to very quickly show two applications of this. One is a study that we did for the city of Surabaya in Indonesia, who's planning to implement a new tramway, which is actually their first public transit project in the city. And in order to make sure that the tram will actually be accessible to the citizens, we did a study of access to these planned tram stops and tested different configurations of planned stops from the surrounding housing environments. And this involved the same use of network analysis, where we routed hundreds of thousands of trips over the network from different home locations to the planned tram stops, using relatively realistic geometric probabilities of which routes these people would likely take. Not just the shortest route, but all plausible routes going from their home to the destination, and then developed an understanding of which stations are going to get most use and occupancy, and also, importantly, which key routes should be going through urban upgrading and improvements, so as to make sure that people actually can get to the tram. And this led to a series of proposals for the city. A lot of these pathways and routes actually go through kampungs and urban villages that are very poor and require drainage as the first prerequisite for being able to walk to a tram, but also landscaping improvements, urban furniture, lighting, and so on. And the second example is the use of this kind of analysis is in fostering urban commerce or planning urban commerce. It's a feature that's very often shown in urban design schemes, and quite willingly or sometimes a bit naively, we want to see commerce in many places of the city. It's obviously not viable everywhere, and the kind of analysis of how much and what type of commerce can stay viable where is an important prerequisite for making it a success. And in this study, this was a study on Cambridge and Somerville, I analyzed the location patterns of commercial establishments throughout the city, and then tried to determine statistically what qualities of location really explain those patterns. In this slide, you see access to public transit, to both bus and T stops around Cambridge and Somerville, calibrated to the actual service capacities of the different stops, depending on how many buses go through them. And access was measured to all sorts of destinations around each shop, to residents, to jobs, to transit locations, to other businesses, and so on. And this is the pattern of all street commerce in Cambridge and Somerville, where we have mainly retailers and food service establishments. And these metrics that were shown in the previous slide were used in a statistical model to kind of predict of which ones of them are actually significantly explaining the pattern we see on the map. And the results are presented as a statistical, with statistical significance as well, and basically we can interpret them as follows. For instance, they're basically divided into three groups. There is agglomeration effects, which basically describes how much clustering between establishments, even independent of context, explains the pattern. Second, there's land use effects, and third, there's sort of urban design effects. From the third, we can, for instance, look at the sidewalk effect. From this data, a 10-foot increase in sidewalks in front of a store on average corresponds to a 3% rise in the probability that the building would actually contain a retailer or store. Or similarly, we could look at, for instance, the proximity to jobs effect. If a building has another 1,000 jobs around it, then its likelihood of hosting a retailer goes up by around 7% in Cambridge. So this is just one example, and there's this is a kind of a rank order of which types of stores are most likely to cluster most strongly with each other. So this is kind of competitive clustering where, and it turns out in Cambridge, sporting goods and hobby and bookshops cluster with each other the most strongly. For instance, the two last categories, they don't cluster at all, which is well explained by retail location theory, because they sell convenience type goods where there's no benefit for the user to go and compare the groceries of one store to the next store, because it's very predictable what they're going to sell. Those are just two very quick examples of the applications of this type of analysis method, and thank you for the attention.
Well, I'm the last one from this group. Let's see if I'm able to add something other. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Charles, Sergio, Daniel, for the invitation. I would like to start my contribution by sharing with you one of my favorite works of heliotropic nature. Matt? Can we dim the lights down? Don't fall asleep.
When the sun sets into a clear, crisp horizon, and when there is no land in front of you for a few hundred miles, and no distant moisture that could become, at the final moment, a backlit cloud that obscures the opportunity, you stand a very good chance of seeing the green ray. The last ray of the dying sun to refract and bend beneath the horizon is the green ray, which is just slower than the red or the yellow ray. Sailors see them more than the rest of us, and they have come to signify, for some, the harbinger of great change or fortune in their lives. For years I've sought out the green ray, peering at horizons for the last fractional second of greenness, not knowing or daring to imagine how extravagant a green splash it might be, but never have I seen it. And then in the summer of last year, as I set off to a small, near inaccessible village on the west coast of Madagascar, I had a quest to try and see, if not film, something that I could not imagine. The point about my film of the green ray is that it did so nearly elude me too. As I took vigil evening after evening on that Morombi beach, looking out across the Mozambique Channel and timing the total disappearance of the sun in a single roll of film, I believed, but was never sure I saw it. The evening I filmed the green ray, I was not alone. On the beach beside me were two others with a video camera pointed at the sun, infected by my enthusiasm for this elusive phenomenon. They didn't see it that night, and their video documentation was watched as evidence to prove that I hadn't seen it either. But when my film fragment was later produced in England, there, unmistakably, defying solid representation on a single frame of celluloid, but existent in the fleeting movement of film frames, was the green ray, having proved itself too elusive for the pixelation of the digital world. So looking for the green ray became about the act of looking itself, about faith and belief in what you see. This film is a document. It has become about the very fabric, material and manufacture of film itself.
In Green Ray from 2001, Tacita Dean, while trying to capture this heliotropic phenomenon, realigns her inquiry to the ontological nature of her medium, film, and its material affordances in registering such ineffable and elusive phenomena. Approaching the end, she concludes by saying, this film, and I quote, has become about the very fabric, material, and manufacture of film itself. I will be focused on ontological nature of our medium as related to sunlight and its qualities, space, and the qualities in fostering human delight. But does the space of landscape include the sky? Asked Tim Ingold in his essay, Materials Against Materiality, when reflecting on the nature of sunlight. This presentation will therefore elaborate on, one, the etymology of landscape as an acclimatization project, and two, one of our design proposals from our officina that I share with my partner, Alexander Häusler, also a Mark II graduate from the GST. The light captures a compelling ambiguity. as a noun and a concept, evokes pleasure through light or without light, as suggested by the prefix de. It is not with light or on light, it is delight. And likewise, in other words, for instance, dehumidify, detract, deforest, decompose. The prefix de is an indication of separation or an act of selective removal. Delight, as I like to think of it, is a curatorial act on light and its corresponding effects on physiological and emotional well-being. But where was the spatial idea of the light initially elaborated from? Well, the light takes us back to the Garden of Eden, where Eden means delight in Hebrew. Described in the book of Genesis, this garden had water, precisely 4 rivers, and trees, many, many of them. Located somewhere in the arid landscapes of Persia, now Iran, where temperatures reach easily 150 degrees Fahrenheit, approximately 65 degrees Celsius, this garden was synonymous of a cooling microenvironment. Effectively, the Garden of Eden, or the Garden of the Light, was essentially a climatization project where direct light was conditioned to reduce thermal stress for human survival. Often associated with ideas of beauty, these gardens of the light were ultimately guardians of human survival. In recent studies on the sciences of beauty, Nancy Etkoff, she teaches at the Harvard Medical School, she defends that beauty, and I quote, is a universal part of human experience, and that it provokes pleasure, rivets attention, and impels action to help ensure survival of our genes. Very interesting. Coming from the south of Portugal, in which sunlight can be ominous, I quickly noticed that once uprooted in Germany, where we moved as a family, opened our design office, my attitude towards sunlight became different, one less guarded and welcoming to direct sunlight. Being comfortable or delighted in Munich meant literally to be in, with, on the sunlight rather than removed from it. And to give you a better sense of what these things look like or measured, in the south of Portugal, where I'm coming from, the Mediterranean climate, we have approximately 25% of the annual loads with very comfortable temperatures, whereas in Munich, we just have 5%. On light availability, we're talking about 5,000 lux in south of Portugal throughout the year, and in the ranges of 2,500 lux in Munich. And for instance, we can see the sunlight, the sunset that we saw in Tacitadine is approximately 500 lux. Obviously, the reduced illumination in Munich reflects the high values of cloud cover, in particularly close to the Alps, where clouds are not, they don't easily move through. Potentially aligned with this reduced access to sunlight, the initial proposal and description of the phenomenon known as a seasonal affective disorder was set forth by the German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin in the beginning of the 19th century, himself living and teaching in Munich. He claimed that reduced exposure to the environmental illumination had detrimental impacts on the biological clocks of our bodies, known as the circadian rhythms. These affect body temperatures, the sleep-wake cycles, and hormonal production, and therefore associated with depression. While the photoreceptors in our retinas capture the sunlight to trigger the circadian rhythms, not every light spectrum is absorbed. Helmut Landsberg, a climatologist and teaching at UPenn, collaborator of Ian McHarg, consultant of the initial development of Chandigarh with Albert Meyer, he claims that selective filtering of light must be linked to our ancestral environments. He writes in his book from '69, before the oil crisis, titled Weather and Health, that the human eye, and I quote, has its highest sensitivity at wavelength around 500 millicrons, approximately in the same waveband in which the solar energy is the highest, and therefore this experience of being exposed to this light can be blinding. This suggests, and he continues, that man was adapted to the much dimmer and filtered light of the forest. And this is where our Bambi comes into play. He's a character that inhabits the forest, and it's also our part of our heliotropic imagination on the project that I will show you soon. The forest is a setting. Its light affordances, gradients, and intensities, and this is the media in which the Bambi is in continual dependency of survival, and we're going to forget that there's a bad ending for Bambi. The project I will show you is in Munich and manifests this heliotropic sensibility. It's a project from 2001 from a competition that we were part of, Munich's Winter Olympic bid for 2018. And I will be focusing on the Bambi-Stadt, the urban block as it emerged from the necessity of being exposed to light and its gradients. Plus is a critical take on the few Munich paradigmatic urban blocks relative to climatic and light exposure. The site was immediately adjacent to the wonderful Olympia Park from '72, a project developed by Benes, Freyotto, and Guter Gzermek, the landscape architect. Here we were already dealing with pioneering strategies, structural and climatic. The site of this project was formed by large amounts of debris from the Second World War and became sculpted to accumulate or to host and accumulate all the larger sports amenities, including terraces in which people and the audience could sunbathe in the summer. Also, Freyotto implemented his full embracing lightweight overhead roofing and the white figure that you see on the plan that connected the Olympic amenities throughout the site. While at the same time being light and transparent, this overhead roofing protected the audience from weather, but also allowed sunlight to get into the sporting arenas and the audience. So Bambi-Stadt is in fact the athletes district and later meant to be repurposed for residential units. And there were several constraints for this residential district as written in the brief. One, it was a very high density development, approximately of 60,000 square meters. Privacy was an important issue due to the games. And there was also an old bosque that you see in the center. There's a danger thing here. Am I supposed to touch on that? So all this bosque of deciduous trees was to be protected and therefore not destroyed. We appropriate, going back to the idea of this garden of the light, and we adapted this into oceanic climate, continental climate as a principle. The walls as primordial separating devices to contain this sheltered microclimate in this project would gain a rather increased climatic protagonism. And we started by creating this inhabited wall, adopting this inhabited wall by wrapping the protected trees as a mega block. Then we then applied deformations and this kind of intuitive, and maybe I want to make a point on that, intuitive, followed by design ideas how space and qualities of space could generate, but also was a strategic move in the sense that we are just occupying the in-between spaces of the boss. So we didn't do 9,000 simulations to get into that. This allowed us several things. In one hand, from the 900 meter, we got an added footprint. We added legs to this Bambi in the sense that we wanted to maximize east-west exposure just to maximize access of light. We also created a double interiority, means there's an interiority here, but there's also an interiority on the other side, also this ambiguity of internal, what is internal and external. We also created smaller blocks as means to break the scale of this large mega block and to generate an increased sense of engagement. We started also to dialogue and to articulate with existing pathways on the site. It was already desire lines on the side. And lastly, on the economic dimension, this allowed us to increase the density of the overall footprint. During this step, we engaged, we started working with the climate engineer Thomas Leiser from Stuttgart to get this structure climatically operative with the necessary residential density. And after a series of iterations and simulations on how to address sunlight access, thinking it's Munich, we set forth a very simple principle based on typological variation and building thicknesses. The building segments along the east-west axis would have a 15-meter depth. This allowed us to have a double-loaded corridor segment in apartments towards east-west, very kind of logic. The north-south axis would have a 10-meter depth with single-loaded corridor segments and apartments to the south with the accesses from the north. And the 12-meter building segments would then allow us to have a hybrid typologies in mediating between these two. And here we have a more diagrammatic location of the 15-meter segment versus the 10-meter, the thinner parts of the legs. Before this work, we kind of engaged in this kind of examining the charismatic block stamps in Munich, the 1920, 1930s block, a wonderful example, but with a low density profile, much lower than what we needed. The 17th century block that was later redensified in the 50s after the Second World War, that was, it offered a much wider, higher density beyond what we also had in mind. And the 1990s, also a postmodern block, had a large FAR, but with very large also apartments. But the tricky part of this, the more revealing aspect of this is that when we start to analyze accumulated radiation in winter, other challenges emerge in terms of light access. The 1990 block, for instance, was totally, many parts of it was in shade, so therefore they were not accessible to light. The 17th century and the 50 was what we see, mostly in shade. The 30 block had several areas towards north and was a double-loaded corridor. So we came about this principle that, came into the conclusion that really the idea of thickening parts that were east-west and minimize the north facades will benefit the project. This, of course, was guided by several simulations and adjustments. So it was all about trial and error based on these protocols that we established from the beginning. For the summer simulation and in comparison, our proposal is definitely most exposed, which is great for winter, but raises several issues for summer. But that's when we started to leverage on the microclimatic affordances of the existing bosques and the existing deciduous trees on the side. This was a phase that we start to sculpt the volume and to start to test the maximum densities, pulling, adding density on certain parts that we also believe that would give a certain presence, such as this tip was one of the entry of the sites. But also we wanted to create, likewise, the Olympic Park from 72, we wanted to create this kind of a new presence in the skyline of Munich, also outreaching the landscape beyond the site itself. And as the Bambi runs wildly and organically on the side as a light catcher, we also started to generate and implement another type of design decision, such as a gradient and the ratio between wall and window according to the solar exposure. So we defined with Thomas that 85% ratio of walls on the facade towards south would benefit the project, 50% east-west, and 50% north, just to keep the thermal mass intact. And Germans are pretty good into windows. So that was a good finding. Lastly, we imagined ourselves, using this kind of design intuition, we we imagine ourselves running amongst the trap clouds of Munich, and we use the undulated profile of the building roof as an added amenity to immerse the residents, firstly athletes and later families, in the skies of Munich, in the weather of the city, with the Alps on the background. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, Holly, Andres, and Sylvia. Clearly, a very wide range of topics that come about with this one theme. I think the only question is indeed, what do we optimize, and where in the hierarchy do we bring these the idea of the sun, and what do we fix and what do we let play out?